All right, we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde to our first ever Conversations in Canadian Bioethics series put on by the Canadian Bioethics Society. My name is Daniel Buckman, and I am the Conference Liaison Officer for the Canadian Bioethics Society Board of Directors. This series is generously sponsored by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our long-standing and returning CBS members, supporting organizations, as well as those who are not yet members and supporting organizations, and we strongly encourage you to sign up to join our community. Our focus today is on bioethics and climate change. The topic focus for our first episode is by design. We thought it's critical to launch our discussion series focused on the biggest existential threat to our survival as a species, which surprisingly has received less attention from bioethics as one might imagine. We will be together today for an hour and a half, and following my introductory remarks, we will hear from our esteemed speakers and followed by a Q&A discussion period. We have live simultaneous interpretation. So please click on that little globe icon on the bottom of your screen to listen to the webinar today in French, or when French, going to English. We will address questions today at the conclusion of both talks. Please do not wait to the end to ask your question. Please write your question in the Q&A. And it will be picked up by Dr. Ravitsky, our moderator. And when you're asking a question in the Q&A, please tell the moderator if you wish to be identified. As you will have no doubt seen at the beginning when you logged on to Zoom today, this meeting is being recorded, and the full session will be recorded and posted either on bioethics.ca or an external site linked to bioethics.ca. So this is if you do choose to identify yourself in the Q&A period. I would also like to do a land acknowledgement. And where I am today, I wish to acknowledge that this land where I'm on today, Toronto or Takaronto, where I am situated. And for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work, live, and play on this land. Many of you are joining us from other traditional territories and unceded Indigenous lands from across Turtle Island, or what is now called North America, and perhaps elsewhere in the world. I encourage you all to learn more about whose land you are on and reflect on how you will dismantle structures of racism and oppression and commit to reconciliation. Please visit nativeland.ca to learn more. So we are here for our conversation series, our Conversations in Canadian Bioethics. We last had our conference, the CBS conference, in 2001 online, and we decided as a board to not hold a conference in 2022. Instead, we decided to create the conversation series to promote discussion about important bioethics topics from across the country, have opportunities for stimulating dialogue throughout the year and not just at the annual conference, engage new members across disciplines and backgrounds to enrich in our conversation. And here on your screen, you can see the extremely talented and wonderful board of the CBS-SCB, board of directors who have all contributed to making this series a reality, and particularly the subcommittee of the board of the folks that you see here, including Dr. Jennifer Gibson, the PI of the SHIRK grant, who's sponsoring the event. I'd also like to thank Dr. Claudia Barnett during her time on the board for helpful contributions to the overall development of this series. So for our conversation series, well, it's going to be 4 episodes in 2022, including our second episode, which will happen on June 14th 2022, and we'll focus on MAID and mental illness as the sole underlying condition. So I encourage you to stay connected to us on our website, bioethics.ca, and our Twitter handle to learn more. Each conversation series will be virtually hosted by one of the CBS's supporting organizations. And today it's actually going to be hosted by us, the board. The topics we selected for the series was informed by our membership, by a membership survey. And importantly, our series is grounded in values of equity, diversity, inclusion, as well as accessibility. And I will mention those in a moment. And just a note for me, our wonderful Zoom tech, Andrew, if you want to put into the chat, if you haven't done so already, the link to the evaluation for those who may not be able to stay to the very end. So under the leadership of the CBS Diversity Officer, Dr. Moji Aduro-Bangba, we have developed a series of values that are guiding this series. And these values served for the subcommittee of the board to decide on and inform our discussions around topics and speakers. And we have asked our esteemed speakers to speak directly to these values in their talk. I'm not going to go over each one individually right now, but in many ways these are wanting to consider values around equity, solidarity, as well as humility, cultural safety, and respect, and so forth, in sort of integrating it in everything that we do and keeping it front and center during the series. And now, without further ado, it is my absolute great honor and privilege to introduce our moderator for the series, who will then say a few words and introduce our esteemed speakers. Dr. Vardit Ravitsky is a full professor in the Bioethics Program, School of Public Health at the Société de Montréal, and a part-time senior lecturer in global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School. She is president of the International Association of Bioethics, director of ethics and health at the Center for Research on Ethics, member of the National Human Genome Research Institute's Genomics and Society Working Group, a 2020 Trudeau Foundation Fellow, and chair of the Foundation's COVID-19 Impact Committee, as well as fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and of the Hastings Center. And it is, we're so grateful, Vardit, that you are here today to join us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for this introduction, Daniel. Bonjour et bienvenue à ce premier événement de la série Conversations en bioéthique canadienne, qui aborde la question urgente de la bioéthique et le changement climatique. As you probably know, the term bioethics was first used, even coined, by Potter, a biochemist and professor of oncology in the 70s, to bring attention to the interplay of ecology, medicine, and human values. But for complex reasons, bioethics ended up evolving to focus on the more concrete ethical problems faced by physicians and patients. Bioethics ended up evolving separately from environmental ethics and focusing more on the individual issues related to autonomy than on a broad view of human health, on justice, global justice, and on concepts related to responsibility. As Daniel said, now knowing that the greatest challenge facing our species and our future health is environmental, it is incredibly important to bring back the environmental perspectives and global justice into the heart of bioethics conversations, as the literature started doing and as this event strives to do. So we have two wonderful speakers that will speak back to back, and will take questions while they're speaking and address them at the end, as explained. Let me introduce first Dr. James Dwyer, professor at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at Upstate Medical University in the US. Jim teaches courses that address ethical issues related to medicine, public health, global health, and the environment. He also works on the Ethics Consultation Service at the University Hospital. His written work focuses on issues of social justice and social responsibility, and he always tries to make his intellectual work of practical value and his practical work of intellectual interest. Very honored to have you with us today. Jim will be speaking about climate change, justice, and responsibility. and the microphone is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Andrew Ross has agreed to help me with the slides. So if we can expand them, we'll get started. Next slide, please. So I'd like to say something today about climate change, justice, responsibility, and then consider bioethics, the implications for bioethics. So let me begin with climate change. Here you see the parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. So before the Industrial Revolution, it was probably about 280 parts per million or 285, and then it increased very slightly until about 1960, and then it began going up quite rapidly. The safe level is probably around 350. We are well past that. In fact, this morning I looked up and we are almost at 419 parts per million. Next slide. So this increase in greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, has had a profound effect on the climate. Temperatures are increasing. We are over 1 degree Celsius higher than we used to be. And it seems to me that we're going to exceed 2 degrees Celsius. Ice cover is decreasing, especially in the polar regions. Storms have become more frequent and more severe, and droughts have become more frequent, prolonged, and resulting wildfires have become more intense. So we've seen fires in places I have not seen them before, like British Columbia and Siberia. The oceans have become more acidic to the detriment of life in those oceans, and there's been other effects as well. Next slide. So all of these effects on the climate have profound effects on human health. So thermal stress has increased, especially damaging for the very young, the very elderly, and also for people who work outdoors in places that are already hot. Storms and flooding have killed people, displaced others, and ruined croplands. And many diseases, cardiac diseases, respiratory diseases, have been exacerbated by the climate change we've had already. Food and water have become more insecure for millions of people. And livelihoods, especially for those who depend so directly on ecosystems, has become more insecure. And finally, we are already seeing environmental migration. So from wars, we have always seen migration. We've seen perhaps 4 million refugees from the war in Ukraine, perhaps 5 million from the war in Syria. And the projections for environmental migration are staggering. By the end of this century, there could be 2 billion, not million, but 2 billion environmental refugees. Next. So here are some images of people who have been affected already. I don't want to claim climate change produced this flood, but it certainly made it more probable. And that's really enough for me, the probabilities involved. So here were people displaced in Mexico. Next slide. Here's 2 farmers in Mozambique where there has been a prolonged drought and they're trying to eke out a living. And when they're no longer able to grow enough crops and sustain their families, they may be forced to migrate, and they will not be counted as international refugees under the term a reasonable fear of persecution. Next. This illustrates how severe water shortage may become. The white area here in Asia are glaciers in the Himalayan mountains. And you see that many of the rivers that feed Pakistan, India, Southeast Asia, and China have their origins in the high plateaus where there are glaciers. In the short run, there will be more runoff as glaciers melt, and in the long run, there will be less water available. Next. So this background on climate change already raises deep issues about justice. So I think to understand justice, we should look at the distribution of the risk, the contributions to the problem, and then whether people have had meaningful opportunities to participate in decisions and policies which so impact their lives. So next. We are all at risk from climate change, and it is an existential question, but we are not equally at risk in the short run or even the medium term. I've looked at 4 factors that shape people's risk to climate change. So the first is temporal position. And by that, I just mean that younger people will be at greater risk in their lifetime than older people. And future generations will be at higher risk than the present generation. The second factor is geographic location. We're all at risk, but people who live on low-lying islands, river deltas, coastal areas, hot regions, drought-prone regions, flood regions, they are going to be at even higher risk. Also, it depends on the kind of society you live in. If you live in a high-income society, you're going to be at lower risk if that society is also well-governed, because that society will have the resources to take public health measures, take adaptive measures, to have insurance forms for people, and so on. But it's not just the wealth of the society, the kind of neighborhood you live in also matters. Because in places where neighbors look in on and out for one another, there's going to be some resilience in the face of the so-called natural disasters that we will be facing. And the final factor is your social position. We have decades of research on the social determinants of health. And what they've always shown is that people who are in any way marginalized through power, income, education, neighborhoods, social position, race, gender, that these people are at higher risk, both for ill health and for the effects of climate change. Now, sometimes these 4 factors will diverge, but sometimes they will all come together. And those people where it all comes together are at especially high risk. Next. But it's not just a question of the risk people are at, but also their contributions to the problems. So this is from Oxfam, put together by Indian economists. But there's also other studies, one by a French economist, that shows a very similar profile. And what you see is if you abstract from infrastructure, which government builds, then the richest 10% of people are responsible for 49% of all the carbon emissions. That's staggering. That is 10% of the people are responsible for almost half of the carbon emissions. On the other hand, if you look at the bottom 50% in income, no matter where they live, in low-income countries, moderate-income countries, high-income countries, the bottom 50% of people are responsible for only 10% of the carbon emissions. So here is one of the great injustices of our time. That is, the people are at the highest risk have produced the least amount of carbon dioxide, and the people who are at the least risk have produced the most. And of course, you can add to that the issue of participation, which I didn't dwell on. Next, please. Because the judgments of justice are so clear and so powerful, I think we should move more quickly to issues of responsibility. And when I say issues of responsibility, I don't mean just legal liability and how you divide the cost of the damage that is occurring. I really mean something akin to responsiveness of how we should respond. So I want to look at those issues. Next, please. I really ask myself 3 questions. What should people who are situated like me take responsibility for? And I put in this awkward phrase, situated like me, because I think that responsibility and responsiveness does depend on how we are situated with respect to other people and to the problem and structures that I've talked about. So what should we take responsibility for? I think we should take responsibility for the social structures, the background conditions, the economic system, the accepted practices that all contribute to climate change, that both encourage it, perpetuate it, and keep it going. So the second question, next, please. Why should people who are situated like me take responsibility? Well, of course, it would be a good thing, and it would be helpful to other people if I take responsibility. But I think the answer to why goes deeper than that. I think it's tied into my relationship to those structures, conditions, systems, and practices. And here I've drawn on the work of Iris Marion Young. And some of you know her work. And before she died, too young, much too young, she wrote a book, or she was working on a book that came to be called Responsibility for Justice. But it could have been called Responsibility for Structural Injustice, because that's what it was about in some way. And the point is that although I'm a small person trying to live a modest life, that is, I produce, reproduce, am implicated in these structures, systems, and practices which contribute to climate change. And that's why I should take some responsibility to change it. Next. So how should people who are situated like me take responsibility? So because I think that these social structures and systems are at the heart of the problem, that I think my responsibility has to be expressed by taking political action in the best and broadest sense of that term. Now, I say in the best and broadest sense of that term because I'm a person who doesn't really like politics, but it seems that it's inevitable and that there's many actions that are in some sense political. And I would include action in civil society, because some of us live in places where large corporations who have lots of money made with fossil fuels can affect the political system. So sometimes the most accessible place to take action is in civil society and trying to encourage people to change political will. And I think I get discouraged quite easily, but even small changes can make a difference. It makes a difference to millions of people, whether the increase in temperature turns out to be 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. So I think we should not be discouraged, but take action that will help in any way possible. Next slide. So what does all this have to do with bioethics? Well, 3 reasons for you to consider. First reason, healthcare has a very large environmental footprint, and most of that's a carbon footprint from its use of energy. And Dr. Richie will be talking much more about this, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But suffice it to say that we are implicated in some of the harm that's being done because we're so closely tied to healthcare. The second reason is I think we need a broader vision of bioethics than simply focusing on healthcare. I think we need to focus on health and really our whole biosphere and what in the biosphere is conducive to health and what poses a threat. So for myself, That's the third reason. That is, I don't want to make this into a definition of what bioethics is. I think bioethics is somewhat fluid and we can change it if we want. But I was interested to begin with, and I'm still interested. And most of the people I talk to are interested in health, human health and flourishing, justice, fair equity and divisions, and responsibility, how we can be responsive to the unjust situations we are in. So that's really three reasons why bioethics should be concerned about climate change. And the last slide, these are the credits for the images I used. So I want to thank you for your participation. I look forward to the next speaker, and I look forward to the discussion at the end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dwyer, for this big picture presentation that launches us into the main issues. And as you said, our next speaker, Dr. Richie, will zoom into the more specific topic of carbon emissions of pharmaceuticals. Dr. Cristina Richie is lecturer in the Philosophy and Ethics of Technology Department at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and the head of the Environmental Bioethics Affinity Group of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. Her research is dedicated to just, sustainable healthcare, often from feminist, queer, or theological perspectives. In 2019, she published the book Principles of Green Bioethics, Sustainability in Healthcare, and is the author of over 50 academic articles. So it's our great pleasure to hear you about this more specific topic. And I'm reminding everybody to post questions into the Q&A as we go along. Cristina, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, James, for setting the scene so well for what I will talk about. I'll be speaking on the carbon emission of pharmaceuticals, and one of the things that was just highlighted in the recent presentation was really the effects of climate change on human health. So because of the amount of carbon emissions, and not only the parts per million in the atmosphere, which contributes to things like asthma and lung cancer, climate change causes other health problems through some of the issues identified, such as thermal extremes, so too hot, too cold, vector-borne diseases, food-related and waterborne infections, and air pollutants, also conflict over depleted natural resources. So there are territory wars over fresh water and other forms of human sustenance. The World Health Organization lists these forms of climate change health hazards, and they've included mental health and well-being in that it's incredibly stressful to live through a climate event. The recent COVID pandemic really highlighted in a lot of ways symmetry between climate change health hazards and what it is like to live through a pandemic. So for instance, if you had to go through a lockdown, or if you had to shelter in place or self-isolate, it's very similar to what happens when the atmosphere is too polluted to go outside and people are recommended to stay indoors because of the high toxic levels. And it is a physical health threat, but it's also incredibly stressful. So we know that as we continue to alter the composition of the atmosphere, these climate change health hazards will increase. And as James rightfully noted, disproportionately affecting the poor, vulnerable, and other people who might have less financial resources to move if there's a climate event, but also less political resources to advocate for policies and practices that might help them better their lives. Moreover, if they don't have financial resources, then they might also be priced out of the healthcare, and therefore they are harmed by the pollution, which in part is part of healthcare, which causes carbon emissions, but also cannot access satisfactory healthcare when they themselves are harmed by it. So as is discussed, the resource consumption and CO2 are related. Everything has a carbon footprint, and that's the typical metric of what's being used these days to discuss climate change and resource consumption. And while it is good in that it is a transmittable metric and we can look at carbon numbers, it really won't help us unless we actually reduce our carbon. And it also doesn't necessarily have normative value until we place it within distributive healthcare justice and also distributive justice among other basic human resources that might be highlighted in something like a capabilities approach that Nussbaum and Sen would have written about. So everything has a carbon footprint. This webinar, you do, I do, the beverage that you're drinking right now, but also healthcare has a carbon footprint. And the global emissions of healthcare make up about 4 to 5% of the world healthcare carbon emissions, putting it on par with the food sector. So it's not insignificant. Healthcare does contribute carbon, and therefore it contributes to climate change and climate change health hazards. This graph indicates the country, the amount of million metric tons that their healthcare system emits in that next column, and then the per capita, so if you divide it by all of the residents, and then what share of the country's carbon comes from their healthcare industry. So I have highlighted Canada right there. And as you can see, the numbers really vary across countries. Not all countries have been tracked, but these numbers don't have any normative significance unless we place it within a few things. So first to highlight is the countries that use the most healthcare carbon, just in terms of numerical value: China, the US. Those are the top 2 polluters also in terms of global carbon emissions, which means that essentially, unless these 2 countries do something to reduce their carbon impact, it's not really going to matter how sustainable the other countries are, particularly the small countries in Europe, because global carbon emissions don't stay within national borders. The second thing to indicate is per capita doesn't actually tell us, is everyone being able to access the healthcare they need? It just tells us that if we look at the number and divide by the number of residents, that's how much the average is. But this doesn't tell us how it's distributed, if people are getting enough healthcare or if they're overusing healthcare. And so that needs to be evaluated as well. And then the third thing that I will highlight in terms of share of the country's carbon emissions from healthcare, more healthcare carbon does not mean better healthcare outcomes. So it would be a fallacy to think that in countries where they have underserved people, we just need to expend more carbon emissions of healthcare. It's not true. If you look at the United States, it's about 8% of the country's carbon, but going back up to Canada, it's about 5% of the country's carbon for healthcare. But Canadians have better healthcare outcomes measured in tangible metrics like dailies, disability adjusted life years, quality adjusted life years, but also just general healthcare in terms of obesity rate, social determinants of health, heart conditions, maternal mortality, premature births. So just because a country expends more healthcare carbon, it doesn't mean that the people actually get better healthcare. And it also doesn't mean that they get the healthcare that they need. And so one of the things that I'm focusing on here is how can we make sense of the carbon emissions of healthcare and align it so that people get the healthcare that they need, but also without overblowing all of the healthcare carbon, because of course we're working within a zero-sum game and that we're already over the parts per million of safe carbon in the atmosphere. And so it's not going to be sufficient to say everyone should just get maximum healthcare carbon, because that will be self-defeating, as it will increase carbon emissions and therefore climate change health hazards. So we need to find a way basically to reallocate healthcare and healthcare carbon in some way, in some ethical way, that will allow the standard of medical care to rise for a great number of people, while also maintaining the standards of healthcare that we enjoy in the developed world, but looking at how to do it better and how to do it more efficiently. So sectorally, studies have been done on where carbon is coming from in healthcare. And in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of environmental bioethics focused on healthcare structures, buildings, water, renewable energy, even food served in hospitals. And that is really important, but in a way, it doesn't tell us anything about healthcare delivery. So it's still the sustainability that you would get from trying to green any other sector, whether it's the cafe that you're enjoying your coffee at, or the pub, or the store where you're shopping. Importantly for biomedical ethics is healthcare delivery and the physician-patient relationship. So within the sectors of healthcare that could be greened or could be more sustainable, pharmaceuticals are consistently among the top 3 contributing sectors, along with clinical services. So when we look within healthcare carbon, the pharmaceutical industry itself, it's more than 50% higher than the automotive sector. Of the studies that have been done, 2 big ones have been tracked. One is US healthcare. So in 2009, pharmaceuticals were about 14% of US healthcare, again in the top 3. 76 million tons. And then in the UK, the NHS, the National Health Services, which oversees healthcare, has been tracking their carbon emissions, and as part of the 2008 Climate Change Act in the UK, has agreed to legally binding carbon reduction measures. So they have some of the best information, not only on what healthcare carbon looks like, but on ways to effectively reduce it, while also still maintaining some standards of care and ensuring that healthcare is allocated equitably. So the pharmaceuticals in the UK are, it was 25% in 2007 and dropped to 12% in 2017, and that's still being looked at. Here are some numbers so you can just see concretely what prescription drugs are being tracked at in terms of healthcare. And so this is an important area to study, not only because it has some of the biggest potential for sustainability in terms of carbon savings, but also because it goes somewhat under the radar. It's not necessarily identifiable, because when you think about hospitals or clinical ethics, it's the machines and the ICU units. And when you think about healthcare delivery, you think about going into a doctor for a visit or a procedure, but the prescription drugs are really, they're part of the fabric of a lot of societies, very much a drug culture in the United States. They are small, so they don't seem like an obvious carbon expenditure, but they're also very prolific. And because of that, they're not usually assessed as something where there could be carbon savings. And they are so much a part of healthcare that they don't get looked at. But it's important that they are looked at for a variety of reasons. This graph shows the largest pharmaceutical producers, and in 2015, when the Obama administration made an agreement with the Paris Agreement to reduce carbon emissions, which is now defunct, but this is what pharmaceutical levels would have had to be like for the major pharmaceutical producers across what they were in 2015, their targets for 2020 and 2025. So you can see some of them, like P&G, would have had to make a dramatic decrease in their amount of carbon emissions. Some of the smaller pharmaceutical companies were already on par with these predictable levels, but something would have had to been done. And it's across the board, of course, because it's not just pharmaceutical companies. They have a variety of factors that lead them to be unsustainable, which I will get into now. So pharmaceutical carbon emissions come from both upstream and downstream sources. So when we want to track where can we reduce pharmaceutical carbon, we can start first with the upstream. And this is mostly research and development. So researching pharmaceuticals, drug compounds, efficacy, clinical trials, all of that has a carbon component to it. The NIHR, the National Institutes for Health Research, has given a document of 17 ways that medical research can reduce its carbon. And so some of these are, for instance, looking at a clinical trial, but trying to address more than one condition at the same time, cutting down on transportation to and from clinical trials, and these sorts of things that can help research become more effective and more efficient. The manufacturing of pharmaceuticals also has carbon, and this is not only in how the drugs would be disposed of afterwards, but also things like, are the pills irregular? Because just like we have the ugly food movement and people prefer tomatoes that are perfectly round, people want pills that are symmetrical, even though they might have the same components and still be as effective. So there's waste in manufacturing. And then, of course, transportation. So not only transportation of people working in labs, but also of the pharmaceuticals as they go out, as they're packaged, repackaged, shipped using fossil fuel, et cetera. This is not my main focus because in a lot of ways it's a bit outside of biomedical ethics. It's more of a technology, engineering, scientist sort of thing. But here you get a better breakdown of really what it is going into the carbon emissions of the pharmaceuticals. So this is from a study done on mental health and prescribing practices, looking at lithium, and you can see the materials, the formulation, the packaging, all of these add up to a carbon footprint per tablet of the pharmaceutical. Again, the normative significance here is not just that we have a number, but that we can find ways to reduce the carbon of this. And we can also say, if we can't reduce the carbon, can we reduce the prescription rates? And that's what I'll be talking about a little bit later. It's important to note that, for one thing, a lot of studies have not been done on every pharmaceutical or every aspect of healthcare carbon, but there have been some studies done, and it really is dependent on where you are in the world. So just as you saw that the healthcare carbon of China and the United States were very high, and the countries have a very high carbon footprint, similarly, things that are manufactured in these countries have higher carbon footprints. So the medications produced in China, the carbon footprint per medication is, as you can see, almost 5 times higher than in the EU. And that's because their infrastructure is less sustainable. So this is really a complex issue that every aspect of life needs to be addressed for sustainability. Of course, it's not just healthcare and it's not just pharmaceuticals. It's everything. It's the way we live. And it's really going to take a reorientation in lifestyles to address the climate issue. So carbon footprints do vary based on location, as does carbon footprints of almost anything. Getting to the crux of clinical ethics, public health ethics, biomedical ethics, and environmental ethics are the downstream causes of carbon from pharmaceuticals, and essentially it's unsustainable prescribing practices, which can be summarized by the word just overuse. So the fundamentals of environmental ethics, if you remember the reduce, reuse, recycle mantra, that reduce was key. And that meant reducing use, reducing need for it, reducing manufacturing, all of that. And then recycling after. So recycling would never have been the first thing, it was always reduce. So here what we see is first overprescription. Polypharmacy is an issue that affects not just the elderly as they might require more pharmaceuticals, but also in that some things that might be over medicalized or taken to have a quick fix through a prescription. So overprescription occurs when there is a more sustainable or non-pharmaceutical solution to something like, for instance, some forms of attention deficit disorder, some injuries that may not require a pharmaceutical, et cetera. Pharmaceutical waste comes from getting a prescription but not using it, or having a prescription that expires. So there needs to be more diligence around giving the clinicians giving pharmaceuticals that will actually be used and not thrown away. And it's not just the downstream effects of polluting water. It is that the carbon comes whether or not the pharmaceutical is used. So if carbon is being produced and then the pharmaceutical is not used, there's no clinical benefit attached to it. So there needs to be more diligence there. Antibiotic resistance, of course, things like the Choose Wisely campaign have highlighted this for years, that when humans are given too many antibiotics for things that are unnecessary or don't really need antibiotics, then our bodies become adapted and they don't become effective when we take the antibiotics, and we need to create new pharmaceuticals. So we can reduce pharmaceutical manufacturing by making sure that we do choose wisely and allocate antibiotics well. Routine prescriptions are another source of unnecessary carbon, in that if you go in to a doctor and they, for instance, say, this is an anti-anxiety pharmaceutical that you can take the next time you have a doctor's visit, but you never indicated that you were anxious and you never asked for it, it's just part of the routine prescription, then that's another form of waste, because you're actually not honoring the patient's autonomy in that they have not indicated any need for it. It's just routine. So looking at it's routine for a reason, reevaluating that. Non-adherence is another form of waste in that people might, for instance, this happens a lot with birth control pills, start taking a pill and it doesn't work out, the side effects are too much, so they discontinue it. Non-adherence can also come when people don't take pills as often as they should because they're worried about the cost. So it's not as effective for them, which means that they may need a new prescription or another prescription. So that needs to be managed as well. Drug dependency is especially apropos with the opioid epidemic and looking at people who become dependent on things, especially painkillers, but also things like the next one, lifestyle prescriptions for non-medical or non-clinically indicated issues. So this might include things like, for instance, pills for lactose intolerance, and everyone loves cheese and milkshakes very much, but if we look at where are we going to get the most clinical benefit, given the gravity of the carbon emissions of pharmaceuticals, lactose intolerance might not be the first place where we would prioritize putting our carbon emissions in distribution of pharmaceuticals. And then finally, lack of preventative health. So when healthcare conditions that could be prevented, such as type 2 diabetes, obesity that leads to cardiac problems, when we don't have preventative health care initiatives, then people get stuck into a situation where they might become needing a pharmaceutical to continue their life. And so more needs to be done on structures of healthy living. So with that, I will come to the ethics of this. It might be self-evident that we need to reduce carbon, that prescribing practices harm patients, and that climate change is one of the most pressing issues that bioethics face, not only because the healthcare industry contributes to climate change, but also because there's a vested interest in ensuring that people are healthy. And when we have altering climate, the healthcare industry is taking care of those people while also working against itself by manufacturing pharmaceuticals unnecessarily and emitting healthcare carbon. So there's three ways to look at this: public health ethics, principles of biomedical ethics, and principles of green bioethics. Public health ethics has already addressed things like pharmaceutical waste, antibiotic resistance, and lack of preventative care. And this is a way that environmental bioethics can form a stream with public health ethics, looking at these things and saying, in addition to the work that's been done here, we might also want to consider the carbon emission and look at more ways to address this more urgently, given that we have, I would say, a social ethical imperative to reduce climate change. In terms of principles of biomedical ethics, when talking with clinicians or other stakeholders in the medical industry, it's incredibly helpful to note that these things like overprescriptions harm patients. They harm them through unnecessary side effects. They harm them through stress of needing to get a prescription, and they harm them through not giving patients the tools to prevent being patients. So obviously, if you don't need to get a prescription, you're probably living a better quality of life and a better medical quality of life. By the time you get to the physician's office requiring a pharmaceutical, you're in some physical pain, distress, or need. So if we look at this selection of overprescription, routine prescriptions, non-adherence, routine prescriptions twice, drug dependency, and lifestyle prescriptions, if these are avoided, then it's better for the patients and physicians can commit to their non-maleficence. And on top of all of this would be principles of green bioethics, which I suggested in that 2019 book. And this parallels Beecham and Childress's 4 principles of looking at if a medical development technique or procedure, such as pharmaceuticals, are sustainable. So in essence, looking first at, is this pharmaceutical a basic medical resource? Is it birth control? Is it antibiotics? Is it pain relief? Or is it special interest access, fertility drugs for those who may not need it, Viagra, lactose intolerance? Resource conservation, does it address a healthcare need? Does it address something that is clinically beneficial and clinically indicated? Or is the pharmaceutical a healthcare want? It's something that's desirable. Hormone replacement therapy, for instance, whereas menopause is a natural part of aging. Simplicity, so reducing dependence on medical interventions, first through preventative healthcare, and then gradational approaches to medical conditions if they appear. So this is about getting people out of the healthcare industry so that they don't need it. And then ethical economics, and this is really highlighted when looking at things like with Zika virus, with COVID, is humanistic healthcare being prioritized over financial profit? The Department of Defense in the United States has a multi-billion-dollar budget for Viagra. And when the Zika virus happened, there were not enough pharmaceuticals available because one representative was saying it wasn't lucrative. So looking at, is this going to be sustainable? And I believe that looking at these 4 principles, it will indicate in a way, will this be sustainable? Healthcare carbon needs to be expended, but it needs to be expended in a way that doesn't jeopardize the health of others through climate change, in a way that allows all people to access basic medical needs, and in a way that is really befitting of the mission of healthcare, which is to treat and serve people so that they can live their best, healthiest lives. That is my book. Those are my references, which you will have access to with the PowerPoint, and that's my contact. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richie. This was a fascinating balance between the 2 presentations, one looking at the biggest global picture possible and looking at natural disasters, and then you, Cristina, focusing on a specific issue, but yet showing its global impact and large-scale impact. So before we address questions from the Q&A, I'd like to ask both of you a very general question that emerges from both of your presentations. Listening to you as an individual, and I hope an individual with some moral values, I was asking myself, what should I understand as my personal responsibility, and what falls on my government and maybe myself as a citizen advocating with my government? So basically us as individual patients, individual providers versus us as citizens who should put pressures on our governments for policy change. So can you say a word about responsibility and local and global justice from the perspective of this distinction between what is our role as individuals, what is the role of governments? Dr. Dwyer, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, I guess I would question the question a little bit. I don't accept this sharp division between what governments do and then what citizens do. So I think we all have some responsibility to address this problem. And people who live in high-income countries with high carbon emissions have more responsibility as citizens. However, I acknowledge that governments have not been very responsive. I mean, the first IPCC report is now 30 years old, and governments haven't responded to that. So I think that citizens and people need to work with other people in associations to try to change either political will and ultimately governments, or to change local measures, or to change national measures. And that's not easy, but the alternative is just to give up and let things get worse. So the alternative seems worse.
Thank you. Dr. Richie?
Part of the therapeutic relationship is being a good patient, but it also means, I think, taking responsibility for one's health in as much as possible. So this means, of course, that we need governments and societies to create places where we can have healthy lives with green spaces, with, you know, inexpensive, healthy food, et cetera. And I do believe that, especially those of us that have the privilege, that are educated and have access to healthcare and have a variety and have a baseline of health, we have a responsibility to keep our health that way. and be active. Not all people have that luxury, and certain people, of course, have higher healthcare needs through no fault of their own. And part of our responsibility is making sure that there's basically healthcare carbon for those who need it or those who need it more. So like many other choices that we make, everyone has a value trade-off in their lives, and that sometimes is in conflict, because maybe you want to fly to a conference, or you want to take a vacation, or you want to reproduce, or you want to have a steak or something. So looking at our own lifestyles, I think first is key. And then when we need healthcare, advocating for ourselves and essentially questioning the doctors. Do I need this prescription? Do you know what the carbon footprint is of this? Is there a non-medical alternative? Things that would serve us better as patients, but things that also require the physicians to do their job, which is to find a way to navigate patient values and their expertise in health and healing. In terms of the government, I do think that the NHS has a really good model for carbon reduction, and that because they are invested in reducing the carbon of their healthcare system, it means that they are also invested in creating these places for healthy lifestyles for UK residents. And this, to me, makes a more holistic approach to healthcare, in that it's all tied together, and they can see that preventative healthcare will make for less patients. Of course, it's not perfect, and there's a lot of gaps and flaws and complaints about the NHS, but there is some way that healthcare, even if it's non-socialized, can take its own responsibility. And I do see things like that happening through the Healthy Hospitals initiatives, through the Catholic Health Association, where organizations are voluntarily taking on measures to promote sustainability, in the recognition that it is better for patient health and that it is part of something that's intimately connected with their mission.
Thank you so much. So we have some fascinating questions, and let's start with a pretty global one that I think goes primarily to you, Dr. Dwyer. As we know, China is a high producer of carbon emissions. However, it's also one of the biggest producers of goods for Western countries, for the global North. So who is responsible for this large carbon footprint? China as the producer, or us, Western countries, as the consumers? Have these issues been explored before?
Well, it's a very good question. So have the issues been explored before? The answer is yes. There were two Canadian researchers who developed the whole concept of environmental footprints. And soon after that, people began discussing, well, lots of goods in our globalized world are produced one place but consumed others. So where do you allocate the carbon footprint or the environmental footprint for that? And I think the best answer is it's at the consumption end, so that the consumers are ultimately responsible. And in a way, we're offshoring the carbon footprint. The pollution is in China, although it spreads then, of course, through the whole world because of the carbon dioxide. But I think ultimately it's the consumers or the consumer countries that are responsible. But it is an ethical question, and it deserves more discussion.
Thank you. Dr. Richie, do you want to add a word about this, or shall I?
Yeah, I would love to. I believe that it's both and that we can't absolve responsibility, because then that essentially says that the Chinese person working in manufacturing is not responsible for their contribution to carbon emissions, whereas we're all responsible. And even if we don't consume one thing, we produce it in another way. And we are still embedded in a system that even if we try to go off the grid, we can't get out of. So I would put responsibility on everyone, but in varying levels and in varying levels of proximity, of course. And essentially everything needs to be overhauled in terms of manufacturing and healthcare carbon. And we know that, if it is China and the US that are the biggest producers of carbon, what do we need to do as consumers then to incentivize them to produce less carbon? And that might be partially economic, and that needs to be considered too, is not just how do we not opt out of it because that might harm workers in China who need to make a living wage, but how do we do it in a way that ensures things like workers' rights and sustainability and justice? And I think it's a very complex question, of course.
Thank you. So in the interest of distributive justice, I distributed the first question to Dr. Dwyer, and I'll distribute the second one to you, Dr. Richie. And this is absolutely fascinating from an anonymous clinician who says, when would it be appropriate for me to discuss environmental and carbon costs of a patient's care in order to discourage my patient from less efficient therapies?
That is interesting. First, I would say you don't even need to discuss it. If there's less efficient therapies, you just say clinical evidence says this. So it doesn't have to be the first thing. A second thing would be finding out patients' values as part of the role of the physician. So do they value things like longevity or non-medication? You know, if it's cancer, is it like a chemo, or is it some sort of surgery and that sort of thing? So I don't think this is the kind of thing that people want to have pushed on them, just like there's not a lot of other, you know, things that are important to us ethically that may not fit the clinical scenario. So it doesn't have to be the environmental approach, and you don't necessarily need to discuss it with every patient. But I found from working at a medical school previously that patients and physicians are eager to talk about it, that they are very open to it. And then if offered, there's been research done from gynecology that giving patients the option, say, hey, there's something more sustainable, are you interested? That sometimes they will choose it, even if it's less clinically effective or not to the highest standards of care, even if it is still a very good basic level of care. I would also indicate if there is someone who's opting, if it's futile treatment, if it's redundant, you have a clinical basis for saying no. If it's outside of your expertise, it might also be worth it to say, you know, you can have this procedure, and one of the side effects is that the carbon from it will contribute to climate change health hazards. So when you leave the clinic, you know, be aware that the floods, the tornadoes, the rising sea levels, et cetera, you may need to be treated for something like an injury due to a hurricane or a tornado. And that is, it's a very long side effect, but it is one of the side effects of getting this medical procedure.
So Dr. Richie, I want to ask you a follow-up question. You know, when we try to ethically buy food and we ask ourselves, how far did this tomato travel and what is the carbon footprint of this broccoli? We're often at a loss because we just don't know. So how would one individual clinician be able to assess the cost, the carbon cost of various alternatives and, you know, provide informed advice to patients who are well-intentioned and want to follow this logic?
This is one of the big problems of the current iteration of environmental bioethics, is there's not just a database. There hasn't been studies done on everything. Certainly, you know, you can look up the carbon of a cataract surgery in Cardiff, but that's not necessarily going to tell you anything about it. And it might not be the most clinically beneficial thing for the patient themselves. So there are some disparate studies. But because of this sort of issue, the metric of carbon, which I indicated at the beginning of my talk, that's one of the reasons why I propose principles of green bioethics, because that way we don't get hung up on things where we don't know the carbon, or the number might be less important than the clinical benefit, or we can't just like sit around waiting for all the carbon to be calculated of healthcare, particularly because healthcare carbon still is only 4% of global carbon emissions. So even if the healthcare industry was eliminated, it still wouldn't be enough socially to reduce the amount of carbon. So I think rather the principal system will be more effective in sort of guiding us towards sustainability rather than relying on CO2 emissions only.
Thank you. Dr. Dwyer, on to you, and potentially for both of you. Should the environmental costs of refrigeration be considered in the rushed promotion of the Pfizer vaccine? Should we have waited for vaccines that require less refrigeration? Very timely question.
Yes. So my short answer is it's relevant, and we should take all those factors into consideration. I don't have any formula for how much weight to give it or how to take them in. But the question of the environmental impact and the accessibility to people who live in places where there isn't refrigeration seems to me ethically relevant. And we should begin to have a discussion of it. And we should try to design things in advance so that they have less impact and they're more accessible to people who don't have all of our amenities.
Dr. Richie, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sort of similarly, these questions come up a lot when we're talking about bioethics, is like, should we do this or should we do that in healthcare? And it would be preferable to just have a society where we don't have to think about trade-offs in healthcare, where the world comprehensively is sustainable, where people in over-carbonated countries have fewer children or have no children, because that is the biggest determinant of sustainability, is essentially, have you reproduced in a high carbon country, even if it's only one child, because it leaves a carbon legacy and not just a carbon footprint. So the trade-offs and the values need to be there ahead of time so that we don't get into things like, should we treat this cancer because it's unsustainable? We want to make sure that there's carbon, when it's expended wisely for human benefit in a way that doesn't compromise other values and other things. So that's, again, why we should be reassessing holistically the healthcare industry, not only in terms of what procedures are being done that could possibly be eliminated completely, like lifestyle prescriptions, which ones can be reduced in terms of amount or length of treatment, and then which ones can be greened in terms of the life cycle. Again, sort of looking at that, reduce the need for it, reuse, recycle sort of mentality of taking a multi-tiered approach to sustainable healthcare.
So almost a follow-up question coming to you, Dr. Richie, from Jeff Kirby, just because you mentioned that concept now. Could you please elaborate on why you consider medical management of things like infertility, lactose intolerance, and erectile dysfunction to, first of all, fall within the category of lifestyle health issues? And second, be examples of the unjust allocation of health resources that contributes unnecessarily to carbon production?
So lifestyle prescriptions would include anything that is potentially medicalized, drawing on the work of Foucault and the medical gaze, and of course Zaza. We know that we're in a society where a lot of things that are just normal variations in human functionings, from things like age-related infertility to subfertility, to lactose intolerance, they're not things that really meet they're not things that can cause physical pain, which doesn't necessarily need to be prioritized over mental pain or suffering, as it were. But they're things that essentially we can live good medical lives without eating cheese, whereas there's alternatives to that. So that's why they would be considered essentially lifestyle. There's, of course, tiers of human flourishing and human healthcare, where at a base level, people are free from pain. This is Howell and Sales' Goals of Medicine. Free from pain, can prevent early death and have a comfortable death when needed, have access to basic healthcare, vaccines, antibiotics, pain management, et cetera. And already in the world, there are people who don't have access to that. So that needs to be the first priority, is getting everyone up to a baseline of standard goals of healthcare. Healthcare systems like Germany, for instance, has a tiered approach to healthcare allocation, and it's very much on this like baseline first. And then in the next level, we have things beyond catastrophic attention to medicine, which would be a first, which would be management of chronic illnesses. And again, we're incredibly privileged that we could even live so long that we have the ability to acquire chronically managed illness, that women are even living to be able to have menopause and hormone replacement therapy, whereas in other parts of the world, dying in childbirth in their teens or early 20s. So this second level of medical care, again, would not fit lifestyle prescriptions. And there's more people who don't even have access to that. And then in that third level would be the lifestyle prescriptions. So it wouldn't necessarily be the case that They are unsustainable. Again, we don't have the carbon emissions on, is your lactose pill very highly carbon intensive or not? I don't know. But what I do know is that the pharmaceutical industry contributes a lot to carbon emissions. So does healthcare, and that everything needs to be adjusted. So in looking at places where we are not going to disproportionately harm those who already don't have access, where we can justifiably reduce the amount of prescriptions, where there are satisfying alternatives to non-medical complaints, which again might reflect normal variations in human functioning, then that's what needs to be looked at in terms of ethics, widely accepted ethics, from environmental bioethics to sustainable ethics to social ethics.
Thank you. We have two big picture questions that I'd like to save till the end, and we have about 15 minutes left. So I'd like to combine two questions that are somewhat related and are really for both of you. The first is this: under climate change, looking ahead, who is working on concepts of adequate health and adequate health care that may be sustainable during the major changes of the next few decades? Because clearly US and Canadian styles of healthcare and flourishing do not seem to be sustainable. And another participant is noting that Gardner and separately Pra and some others have proposed a global scale transition and ethics commission to promote these solutions that Dr. Richie would like to see already in place. So what do we think about trying to establish a global governance organization that can actually control and fairly distribute environmental costs and balance them with flourishing lives? So let's start with you, Dr. Dwyer.
So I'll try to address the first part of the question. I think sometimes we get hung up too much on medical care, and we focus in bioethics too much on biomedical care. And when we take a broader view, what we really want is people to live relatively long lives, flourishing at low environmental impact. And the answer is that's where we need to go, but there's some examples that are already there or much further along than Americans certainly, and further along than Canadians. And I'll give you an example. So many years ago, I used to look to the Nordic countries as an example in some way. But now I look more to countries like Costa Rica. So Costa Rica is a very interesting example because the life expectancy in Costa Rica is the same or a year greater than in the United States. So it's probably a year less than in Canada. But the environmental footprint in Costa Rica is only 1.5 Earths, where in the United States, it's over 5, and in Canada, it's very similar. It's near 5. So I really think there are examples of where we need to be going. I'm a little pessimistic because I think there's going to be a lot of problems in the coming decades, like environmental migration and so on. So I think we have to be prepared ethically to address those and how we're going to respond. So I think it could be somewhat chaotic in the transition to whatever's in our future.
Dr. Richie, do you want to tackle the same part of the question or maybe talk about global governance as well?
Yeah, I think it's more about the second part of the question. So there's, these ideas like One Health, where we're looking at a holistic system of what is health and what is healthcare. That might be good examples, but I don't think it's going to be a global entity. I really think the claims of subsidiarity are important, and that, again, when we say it's a global actor, when I talk with students and they say like, it's the government's responsibility or it's the corporation. And I say like, but who is the corporation? It's made up of individuals. So we're all responsible for it some way. So subsidiarity basically says you work at the level that you're at. If you're an individual, there's ways that you can manage your health or ask for lower carbon alternatives. If you're a clinician, you can advocate for policies that are more sustainable, become aware as part of your professional development and commitment to non-maleficence, that you prescribe minimal health care that's best for the patient. governments obviously and healthcare organizations have I would say an explicit duty to not do things that are going to harm their patients, like participate in unsustainable practices. And the Catholic Health Association had a big conversation about divestment from fossil fuels specifically for that reason. But at the end, it's how serious is society about climate change? And I don't think they're very serious at all. And so in a way, it doesn't matter if we have one governance allocating healthcare carbon. We're already over the parts per million. And the people that are in those organizations still daily participate in these structures that are unsustainable. And so in a way, it just doesn't seem like anything is going to get done, even if we do our best to initiate anything, because I think the policies would have to be quite draconian to get the world in a place where climate change would not be an issue or not be an imminent health threat.
Thank you. I really loved the do what you can where you are. That really speaks to each of us with all the different hats that we're wearing. I'm getting to a very big question that is exceptionally timely now after the pandemic, when we're hoping to gradually emerge, and we're seeing the impact of the last couple of years on the level of trust in science that the public has. And the question is from Corey Andrew Lebrec, who says, in the spirit of humility, how do we constructively engage with climate deniers in these conversations in order to properly mobilize the masses to act for the environment? And I think this is one of the million-dollar questions in this debate. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to join in.
Please.
So one of the organizations that I am part of, and I've mentioned the CHA, but also the Environmental Theological Society, and I had been running for years the Bioethics affinity group there. Evangelicals in the United States are notorious climate change deniers. So this is something that I've written about and I've thought about, and so I'm excited to give an answer. So the idea is there's two things that really come, like, who are climate change deniers? One denies that it's anthropogenic, and one denies that climate is changing. So the first one is, are humans accelerating it or not? Those people you can talk to. If they're going to say there's no changes, that climate is not changing at all, you can't talk to those people. They're, say, invincibly ignorant, because there's just hard scientific evidence that climate is changing. So I'm just going to ignore those people. The climate change deniers, however, that say that it's non-anthropocentric, what you can do is a way to talk to them is bypass that issue and look at climate change health hazards and say, fine, we're not even going to discuss who's causing it. We don't even have to acknowledge that it's there. However, we do know that when there are tornadoes, for whatever reason, people get injured. And so we have an obligation to minimize health impacts from these things as part of just a broad way of building consensus that society needs to manage these issues. So I think that it can be very constructive. A similar thing is building consensus around things that, like abortion, where pro-life or pro-choice, the place of agreement is that fewer abortions would be better for whatever reason politically that you agree. And so instead of addressing what the concern is initially, looking up the outcome and going with that, where we can speak to people's rationality, or at least appeal to their emotions that this causes healthcare issues. I think that's really important. And that is a way that builds bridges while also allowing things to progress and not stymie under the discussions of what is the cause. Just go to the effect.
Thank you. Dr. Dwyer.
Yeah, well, this may sound discouraging, but I'm convinced, like Dr. Richie, that there's 5 to 7% of the people who are just invincible. You cannot discuss with them. You cannot establish trust. They're absolute deniers. And in some way, we've seen this with the pandemic, with the vaccine deniers or the whole COVID deniers and so on. But then there's a large number of people, 92 or 93%, who it's possible to establish trust and possibilities of common action together. So I think this question is really about, well, how do you establish more social trust? And how do you be more civil in the discussion? And I don't think there's any easy answer to that. I mean, I think if anything, the societies are moving in the other direction, or the wealthy societies are, in sort of what I call the sort of pandemic individualism, where people won't even wear a mask to help other people and so on. So I think we have a hard road ahead of us, but that's not a reason to give up. It's a reason to try to be creative about this.
Thank you. Wonderful advice from both of you. Another very practical question. What are your favorite activist organizations working on improving health while cutting carbon costs? And to which do you think ethicists and philosophers can best contribute?
Well, Dr. Richie can start.
I think Sierra Club has done a lot of good work in the United States. The NHS is actually doing really good work in terms of calculating their carbon. But beyond that, it seems to be these pockets. So Harvard Medical School has Students for the Environmental Movement. And more and more, I think that the organizations, it can't just be NGOs and governments. It really needs to be trickled down through the medical schools and through the education of physicians. The General Medical Council in the United Kingdom has climate change as part of the professional competencies that need to be mastered for clinicians. And just saying we live in a world where we need to be aware of climate change and what it does to health, and also our impact on healthcare. So those are some of my favorite organizations. And if you look at the participant list, there's a great number of people there that are working on this issue, that run centers and publish work and write books. And so I think we're like among a great peers here in terms of who's working on it. And I know that we're all working very hard on this issue. So applause to everyone on that.
Thank you. Dr. Dwyer, do you want to share with us your personal favorites?
Sure. I'll mention three. One is the organization 350.org. I think they've been involved from the beginning and tried to hold the carbon emissions below 350 and suggested ways to return to that. The second one is in the International Association of Bioethics. There's an environmental bioethics affinity group or interest group or network, it's called. And that has often sponsored discussions at the International Association of Bioethics meetings. And the third one is, I think there should be this kind of interest group in the Canadian Bioethics Society. So maybe it already exists, or maybe for the next conference, when we can return in person, it should be started, or at least people who have this shared interest should get together, much as the student groups did many years ago.
That's a great idea. Danielle is taking notes. We're coming to our last question that expands the conversation from healthcare to health research. So Gabrielle Samuel is asking us, how can we think about the environmental impacts of health research compared to healthcare, given the environmental impact of research? For example, genomics research is trying to help those with genetic diseases, but requires an ever-increasing amount of energy. How do we go about curbing a field of research while saying to people with, for example, rare conditions, or those who have children with rare conditions, that we are doing this? Well, this might be an end goal to, kind of prioritize areas of research with lower carbon impact. What about the social sensitivities around this topic, which are immense? Dr. Richie?
Again, it shouldn't have to be a trade-off between doing research. Science can't be curbed because of the carbon emissions, but other things can legitimately, and things that don't necessarily affect human health and flourishing to such an extent. So reliance on fossil fuels, automobiles, fast fashion, red meat, rice paddies, etc. These are things that we can say again, we have a limited amount of carbon. It's a zero-sum game. So what do we want to curb? I don't think that we should be saying don't do research because it's carbon intensive. But when you're doing research, what kind of research? Like, are you researching just how to make tomatoes more perfectly round? Or are you researching so trivial or significant? Henry Shue talks about luxury and subsistence emissions. And I think that's a really good place to start in terms of conceptualizing. We have to give up something. What do we want to give up? And where can we make things more sustainable? So again, the NIHR, the National Institutes of Health Research, has a carbon reduction strategy for researchers. And of course, it promotes science, research, discovery, innovation, and it should. And we should really, those are broad social values that benefit, hopefully, everyone in the world. So that needs to be looked at, while also having the sense, as has been mentioned, humility and carbon savings and parsimony, and looking at places that we can manage our carbon without treading on these big social values that we want, like research on genomics.
Wonderful and inspiring answer. Thank you. We have only about 2 minutes left because Daniel has some concluding remarks. So Dr. Dwyer, your last word on this.
No, I'd just like to thank the organizers. I think there's a real need to expand the scope of bioethics. And I think for too long, it's focused on very sensational cases that affect just a few individuals. And I think we really need to bring these environmental issues back into the mainstream of bioethics. So I think this has been a good start.
Wonderful. Cristina, half a minute of last word.
No, I agree. Just thank you for organizing, and thanks, of course, to the support of, again, I looked at the attendees, and there's standing on the shoulders of giants and talking together like this. I think that this will go and produce great dividends.
Thank you so much to both of you for the presentations and the fantastic discussion. And Daniel, back to you for conclusion.
All right, thank you very much. Again, I just want to thank Dr. Dwyer, Dr. Richie, and Dr. Ravitsky for a phenomenal panel. Much fodder here for reflection and discussion, and duly noted, Dr. Dwyer, about the affinity group of the Canadian Bioethics Society. And hopefully, our members did hear the call for an affinity group at the CBS. I think that's a wonderful idea. And also, agreeing about expanding the scope of bioethics beyond, those issues that particularly affect the privileged few. I just, in conclusion today, thank you all. Please please fill out the survey. That's included in the chat. And just, I want to put a plug in for episode 2 in our conversation series, where we're on June 14th, 2022 at 1 p.m. Eastern time, where we are going to focus on MAID and mental illness as the sole underlying condition. A very timely and controversial topic, to be sure. We're thrilled to have Dr. Mona Gupta, Kathleen Lowenstein, and the session moderated by Dr. Eric Cristina, and potentially others as well. And this conversation series episode will be hosted by the Nova Scotia Health Ethics Network, a Canadian Bioethics Society supporting organization. So please visit our website for more information. Check us out on Twitter and elsewhere, and we look forward to connecting with you all again at future episodes and online, and hopefully one day in person. So thank you all.